Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. You're all very, very welcome indeed to the first alumni Zoom event of the new academic year. My name is Jane Ohlmeyer, and I'm actually Professor of Modern History at Trinity College, Dublin. And it's a real privilege for me to be invited to chair this session with my dear friend and colleague, Brendan Kane. For those of you who don't know me, I work on Ireland and Empire in the early modern period. And so I'm really familiar with Brendan's work. He really is a leading authority on early modern Britain and Ireland, the Reformation, the early modern Atlantic world, and he's based at the University of Connecticut. Brendan has a wonderful pedigree. His BA was from the University of Rochester, an MPhil in Irish Studies from NUI Galway. Brendan, I always, that chokes that it's Galway, not Trinity, that we can't claim you. But anyway, and then a PhD from Princeton. Before he went to the University of Connecticut in 2005, he spent a year as an NEHQ fellow at the University of Notre Dame. And he's currently very active in the Northeast Conference on British Studies, and he's the member at large of Celtic Studies Association of North America. He has published extremely widely. I'm just going to mention a couple of his books. The Politics and Culture of Honour in Britain and Ireland, 1541 to 1641, is a Cambridge monograph that came out in 2010. He has a wonderful book with Tom Heron, Nobilities and Newcomers in Renaissance Ireland, that actually it was the catalogue of a fantastic exhibit at the Folger Library. And you can see Black Tom behind him in the Zoom room. And then most recently, he has co-edited Elizabeth I and Ireland with Valerie McGowan Doyle. He has many, many articles, including in my own Cambridge History of Ireland. And in terms of his work, he, to my mind, is doing some of the most interesting, exciting, and important work on early modern Ireland. Tonight, he's going to talk about Elizabeth I in Ireland, the Irish and England. We are hoping there'll be time for questions at the end. And if you have any questions at all for Brendan, please put them in the chat box. And then I'll probably ask them on your behalf after the lecture. So without further ado, Brendan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jane. It's really a pleasure to be introduced by you. Thanks so much for the kind words. And I just want to thank Paulina for the generous invitation, to Peter and Brittany for all their help and encouragement along the way. And thanks to all of you for taking some time out of your evenings to think with me a little bit about Elizabeth and Ireland and the Irish and Elizabeth. So let's get going. And as Jane said, there will be a little bit of time, but this is a legitimate offer. If anybody wishes to get in touch with me by email, there's my email. You can also follow me on Twitter if you wish. Don't worry, it's professional Twitter. It's all good. So anyway, off we go. In September of 1566, Elizabeth I visited Oxford. On that occasion, she gave a very brief speech praising her host for the performance of learning with which they had welcomed her, a series of scholarly disputations, orations, and the like having preceded her address. In it, she thanked and lauded her hosts, and she downplayed her own learning, claiming it was not worthy of that which had been displayed in her honor. It was a short speech, but resonant for our occasion for two reasons. First, it marks another anniversary, namely the Queen's visit to the university, which is our host this evening, virtually, and so worthy of acknowledging. Second, delivered as it was fairly early in the reign, it reveals some themes that would not only go on to be important during her queenship, but ones that also might help frame our conversation regarding how she viewed her second realm and its peoples, and perhaps how they viewed both her, in her person and her office, and the culture of which she was a part and represented. She opened the speech with these words: "Those who do bad things hate the light." And she closed with these: "I will make an end to this my speech full of barbarisms, if I may add two wishes I have in mind. that while I live, you may be most prosperous, and when I die, you may be most blessed. I have spoken. I think we might take three things from her words to that Oxford audience so long ago, which may serve as guide for our conversation this evening. The first is that in spite of the self-deprecation and the grace, she left it in no doubt about who was in charge. She saw her listeners' prosperity as bound up in her own mortal journey, and when she was done speaking, she was done. Here we see Elizabeth as divine right monarch. Secondly, I'm intrigued by the matter of lightness and darkness as metaphors for the good and the bad, and how one could be deployed to banish the other. In political terms, we might translate the language of badness to disloyalty, and the bringing of light to crown intervention into the so-called dark corners of the realms. And indeed, much of what would drive relations between Elizabeth and the Irish would revolve around specifically this dynamic, namely concerns over transparency of motivation, of trust, and the naturalness of action on the part of both subject and monarch. The third and final thing I wish to highlight is the mention of barbarism. Barbarism is, of course, a category of ancient vintage used to describe the foreign, the unintelligible, the crude, and at times the threatening. In her speech to the gathered worthies on that September day, the mention of barbarism was a matter of self-deprecation, of acknowledgement that her command of classical languages and rhetorical forms was no match for that found at the university. It was a harmless use of the term, but the discourse of barbarism, of incivility, would prove of great importance in Irish-English relations over the course of her reign. But as we'll see shortly, I hope, it was one of great variation and which was deployed in very different ways to very different ends. So I want to spend the next 40 minutes or so thinking about Elizabeth's views of Ireland and the Irish, and Gaelic Irish views of the Queen and England itself, and in so doing, keep those three frames in view. Necessarily, this exploration must be cursory and much will be passed over. I beg your forgiveness, but hopefully there will be enough brought to light to open up some new ways to think about that relationship, or at the very least, to provoke a good Q&A. And again, you can be in touch with me. So speaking of Q&A, let's start with a question. Why might we wish to consider this relationship, Elizabeth and the Irish and Elizabeth? Surely this has been covered before. There is indeed quite a bit written about the Queen, about Ireland, and about English-Irish relations in this period, and it remains a lively area of scholarly research and of great interest to a broader public audience. But I want to suggest here that Elizabeth I and the Gaelic Irish share one critical thing in common in the scholarship on the period, and that is to say that they are both abstract. They're abstracted, they serve as categories rather than sort of objects of inquiry in their own right. So let's see. Oh, look at that, it works. For instance, there's quite a bit written about Elizabethan Ireland or Elizabethan views of the Irish, but the objects of study here are the writings by figures such as Edmund Spenser, poet and colonial administrator in the Munster Plantation, or Sir Henry Sidney, longtime viceroy of the realm and father of Sir Philip Sidney, but not of Elizabeth herself. Looking from the opposite direction, there is a well-established tradition of considering the Irish perspective as monolithic, as representative of some sort of Celtic collective mind. Individual works by this approach serve to highlight aspects of that mind or that culture, but variant perspectives of their authors can remain obscure. This tendency to abstract the Queen and the Gaelic Irish is perhaps exacerbated by a tendency to distance events in Ireland from those in England to such an extent as to render them incomparable and necessarily treated as sui generis. As examples, we might take the catalog for the Elizabeth Now and Then and Now exhibition at the Fulcher Shakespeare Library, which includes a sensitive and sophisticated discussion of Ireland, but it is placed in a chapter entitled Foreign Relations. Or we might take the classic primer on Tudor rebellions, which argues for a general trend toward domestic peace across the reign. That, of course, would be hard to argue if we considered Ireland, which exploded into rebellion in Munster in the so-called Desmond rebellions in the middle of the reign, and rebellion in Ulster at its end, what came to be known as the 9 Years' War, many other examples of unrest in between. But the authors of that work place those conflicts in the category of colonial ones, and thus more akin to cultural encounter overseas than to insurrectionist politics at home. I don't think this is how Elizabeth would have seen things, nor do I think this is how the Gaelic Irish would have seen them. Let me hasten to add, and this is legitimately so, that the items displayed here are some of the fundamental texts for grappling with the period. I cast no aspersions, but I do feel much work has been done and much more work needs yet to be done. In attempting that work, my approach for the evening is simple. I wish to take seriously that Elizabeth believed those in Ireland to be her subjects, and the Irish understood her to be their prince. From that starting point, I wish simply to ask, what did Elizabeth herself think of Ireland and the Irish? And conversely, what did people writing in the Irish language think of Elizabeth and of the culture she was a part of, ruled over, and represented? This is a large subject about which we might say much, but here I want to keep to three things, each framed by that shared concern over badness and its enemy light and of forms of barbarism. The first is that in spite of the discourse of civility and savagery that occupied so much of the policy making and policy lobbying, Elizabeth was no ethnographer. Her concern with barbarism in her Western realm was not Spenser's. She was not exercised, as he was, about inherent savagery or heart of darkness style cultural degeneration as a justification for cultural or perhaps real genocide. Rather, she was concerned about light, transparency, trust, the bonds between monarch and subject. The Irish to her were simply subjects. Barbarous, yes, but more in keeping with the way she deployed the term in her Oxford oration. Crude, unlearned, not quite ready for prime time, but redeemable, and with a place in civil society. However, should those subjects engage in bad things, then she would make them hate the light. Elizabeth, I want to be clear, bears much of the responsibility for the disaster that was early modern Ireland. This is not a good Queen Bess story tonight, but her path to that point was in certain ways unique from that of her counselors and courtiers. Secondly, I wish to explore the emergent awareness by Gaelic observers of England and the people who lived there. There is quite a bit written about Irish views of those English in their midst, be they of Anglo-Norman extraction and families long resident on the island or of recent arrival. But there is almost none about how they thought of the society to which they were yoked by constitutional innovation, Ireland having been made a kingdom under the English crown in 1541. If they were subjects of the English crown, what did they make of that realm, the people in it and how they conducted themselves when there, and of course, about the figure who governed over it and represented it. And here I wish to make two observations. The first is that an awareness of Irish writings of the centrality of London to Irish cultural and political life was a phenomenon in the latter half of the 16th century, and that view of the metropole was one that was viewed in primarily the frames of darkness and barbarism. The English had no monopoly on those discourses. It ran the other way. Secondly, I want to say that the Irish returned the favor, so to speak, to Elizabeth, which is to say that whereas she took them seriously as subjects, they took her seriously as prince on the European stage. But, and this is critical, as subjecthood carried both rights and responsibilities, so did supreme executive authority. And much of the horror that was visited upon Ireland was, at least in the literary record that survives, laid firmly at her feet. So, let us start with a brief overview of the situation obtaining in Ireland at her accession. As noted earlier, Ireland was a kingdom under the English crown, made so by 1541's Act for Kingly Title, passed in both the English and Irish parliaments. This is John Speed's famous early 17th century map of Ireland with its kind of ethnographic gaze along the side, gentlemen all the way down to the wild Irish down below. man on the left, woman on the right. Progress toward religious, cultural, and political reform, what we might think of as coming under the heading of Anglicization, was slow. Plantation had already begun as a means to speed up the progress. Under Mary I, a rebellion in the Midlands to the west of the Pale by a number of Gaelic lords and their followers was followed by the establishment of small plantations in the Queen's and King's counties, later to be known as Laoch and Offaly. These were limited affairs, but nevertheless they marked a new way forward, something of a social engineering effort to make Ireland English, to use Jane's phrase, by the physical exportation of English people to Irish lands. In terms of social makeup, three broad groups were emerging. Now, these are not hermetically sealed, and we can think of these as interest groups, but nevertheless, for kind of heuristics, I think this is worthwhile. One, obviously, is the Gaelic Irish, those whom we might think of as the indigenous. Secondly, are the Old English. These people, this is a term that would really come into the parlance later in the 16th and really the 17th century, but nevertheless, these were people who were descendants of the Anglo-Norman invaders of the 12th century. They styled themselves the English Irish, which is to say English subjects who just happened to reside on a different island. But that collective identity started to take on a new comparative form, Old English, to distinguish them from a host of newcomers who had flooded into the island as part of the process to anglicize the culture, the politics, and the worship in the Western realm. We might take the Earls of Ormond, again, that's Black Tom Butler, 10th Earl behind me, the Earl of Kildare, Earl of Desmond as examples. Now, this third group, these latter folks, and they were a very diverse group, would come in time to be known as the New English. We might take Sidney and Spencer as examples. Of those groups, she was, of course, familiar with the last, reasonably well acquainted with the second, but how about the first? What did she make of the Gaelic Irish? As we ponder that, we must bear in mind that she was inheritor of a general prejudice against the Irish, something made manifest in discriminatory legislation, such as the Statutes of Kilkenny of 1366, which sought to outlaw native custom, and of antiquarian writings, such as those of the 12th century propagandist Gerald of Wales, or Carolus Cambrensis, that cataloged the bestial qualities of Irish behavior and practice. But all was not prejudice, and she was also the inheritor of a long tradition of Irish Gaelic lords submitting to English monarchs and to a tradition, if not a robust one, of Gaelic Irish denization, by which individuals could enjoy the rights of English subjects. Looking chronologically more closely, she was inheritor of a process known as surrender and regrant, begun by Henry VIII at the time of Ireland's creation as a kingdom. The process was meant to do two things: to translate the status and territorial claims of Irish lords into forms legible in the English system, and secondly, in doing so, to get those at the top of the Irish hierarchy to buy into the system because aristocratic delegation was necessary for governance in Ireland, but also across the realm, domestically. So how did the process work? A supplicant would come before the king or his representative, surrender their claims to status, so to be, say, the O'Neill, and to the lands that they traditionally laid claim, and then to have the first re-granted back with an equivalent English social title, so for instance, an earldom, and to have their lands re-granted by legal patent. There were some fantastic and quick successes to this process. The head of the O'Neills came back to Ireland as the Earl of Tyrone. The head of the family, the O'Briens, came back to Ireland as the Earl of Thomond. Not all was rosy with this process, but it at least allowed Elizabeth to see some of the Gaelic Irish not simply as subjects, but as functioning members of the political nation. And clearly she had to know something about Ireland and the Irish for the simple reason that in the wake of surrender and regrant, there were more Irish folks about the court. And moreover, she would have had some sense for matters from her beloved cousin, the Old English Earl of Ormond, Thomas Butler. And he, for his part, and there he is, in Again, you can see the repro behind me. And he, for his part, decorated his estate, the long room of his estate in CARRICK-ON-SUIR, with plaster friezes of the Queen and of Edward VI, actually. Now, that said, it is certainly the case that Elizabeth was largely ignorant of her second realm and its peoples, never having set foot there. In a telling moment in 1573, well into her reign, she inquired of the Earl of Essex, who was engaged in attempts to establish a colony in the northeast of the island, quote, "What kind of people inhabit these countries?" That ignorance was not reserved for those in the dark corners of the north, but also in the well-lit English-controlled Pale. In 1562, Christopher St. Lawrence, 7th Baron of Howth, an English-Irish grandee of the Pale, was dispatched from Dublin to attend Elizabeth I at court. He was charged with an important task: to defend Lord Lieutenant, so this is the Viceroy of the Crown in Ireland, Lord Lieutenant Sussex's campaigns against the rebellious Shane O'Neill and the tax or cess he imposed on Irish residents to fund them. At stake in this visit were the greatest questions of governance across the realms, namely the completed conquest, defense, and financial upkeep of the Tudor monarchy's Second Kingdom. Howth must have seemed a natural choice for this vital mission. He was no mere administrative lackey, but a noble descendant of the 12th century Anglo-Norman conquerors of Ireland, one of the self-identifying English-Irish elites who held swaths of the island in the crown's interest. A local lord of ancient lineage and hereditary loyalty, Howth was also privy to the most intimate discussions of Sussex's administration. Yet in spite of the lieutenant's careful selection of this native English noble to defend his administration and its policies, the initial meeting of emissary and monarch demonstrated that things which seemed clear in Dublin were not equally so in London. When presented with Howth, Elizabeth inquired whether Sussex's representative, quote, could speak the English tongue. That comment should not be taken as a sign that she thought this visitor was irredeemably barbarous or not proper for the court. At some level, it was simply a question of curiosity. And she, in fact, showed considerable interest in the language. The famous primer prepared by Christopher Nugent, Baron DELVIN, seems to have been a product of a request from her stemming from her interest to learn something of the language, DELVIN himself being a student at a competing institution nearby to our host institution this evening. In it were the basics of alphabet, you can see those, some foundations of grammar, thus vowels, diphthongs, elementary vocabulary, man, woman, queen, and also some short phrases that one might use. She also sponsored the creation of an Irish type, the first product of which would be Sean Carney's Abadil Catechism, which was a brief primer on the alphabet attached to a Reformed catechism. As we think back to her oration in Oxford in 1566, she was keenly interested in languages and in being Prince to her people. And although it might be stretching things, she may have seen the learning of Irish to be part of that bulwark against that barbarism that was ignorance. The refusal to preach and to missionize in the Irish language does, of course, demonstrate the very clear limits to the broader Protestant interest in the vernacular. But from the top, there was at least some tangible and rather extraordinary interest in the indigenous language of what she considered her Western realm. At a fundamental level, however, it didn't matter what the Irish spoke or what cultural practices they followed. To Elizabeth, the overriding concern was that they were her subjects, and as subjects, they should conduct themselves accordingly. When they did not, whether it was an English-Irish grandee like the Earl of Desmond or a Gaelic lord like Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, she was keen to see them punished. In doing so, it is worth remembering and taking seriously that her perspective was unique. Everyone in the realm was her subject, from farmer to burly, and she no one's but God's. As such, the things that motivated her demands for intervention in Ireland need not have been precisely those that drove a Sidney or a Spencer. For instance, where Spencer was deeply concerned about arresting degeneration and eliminating cultural difference, and Sidney was concerned about true religion, they were both concerned about both, of course, Elizabeth took a more personal offense. Routinely, she brushed aside claims of Irish rebels acting in the name of true religion or out of savage inclination. Rather, she expressed outrage at the insult to her personal honor. For instance, the sense of personal connection and reciprocal bonds of vertical honor linking monarch and subject pervades Elizabeth's remarks on Hugh O'Neill at the end of her reign. There is a later image of A. More. And she never tired of mentioning that it was she that had brought O'Neill up, and thus it was she who could bring him down into obscurity once more. A notable aspect of how honor imperatives helped shape the Queen's reaction to rebellion was her rhetorically powerful claim that they drove her to act against her otherwise merciful nature. To Sidney, she made clear her mind, quote, that we think it not for our honor, but rather to the increase of the obstinate audacity of Shane O'Neill to have you remove any treaty with him. That is to say that the second Earl of Essex is merely the most spectacular example, but not the only one, of someone charged to govern Ireland, but who got in trouble with his monarch due to their willingness to negotiate with rebels when the Queen wished them unequivocally reduced to law, order, and obedience. In these situations, Elizabeth appears to have been no ethnographer and was evidently not engaged in othering as a strategy to conquest. Even when dealing with the head of the O'Donnells, a kin group resident in arguably the most remote part of Ireland at the time, she simply referred to him and his followers as, quote, doubtful subjects. Indeed, she made it known that the very person who should be charged with civilizing the local inhabitants of what we now know as Donegal was none other than the O'Donnell himself. Gaelic Ireland may have been considered amongst the rude parts of the realms, but the Queen also described the borderers of the north as lewd. It's the north of England. More so than over cultural difference, she seems to have fretted over the secret character of rebel intention. This seems a point worth considering, especially in light of the escalating sense of crisis that gripped the regime, reaching an apogee of panic in the 1590s. Whatever her thoughts on incivility, it does appear that her abiding concern was not with cultural difference, but with falsity. This was, after all, the great age of spy networks and judicial torture. In spite of her public assurances that loyal subjects should fear no examination of the, quote, secret opinions of their consciences, the category of loyal seems to have been fluctuating enough to make many people feel very, very concerned over exactly such examinations. And as she expressed to the Scottish ambassador William Maitland in 1561, she had very little faith in her subjects' fundamental loyalty, whether they were in England or whether in Ireland, saying, I know the inconstancy of the people of England, how they ever mislike the present government and have their eyes fixed upon the person that is next to succeed, and naturally men so disposed, plures adorant solem orientem quam occidentum, right? Or favor the rising sun than the setting. Indeed, given Elizabeth's paranoia to distinguish natural from unnatural subjects in both realms, it might be worth considering the regime's actions in Ireland as more akin to inquisition than imperial cleansing. Proto-racial language may have been on the rise, but it was not a hegemonic discourse or one seemingly engaged in by the supreme authority in the realms. This is not to absolve her of the responsibility for the horror that was the Desmond Rebellion, that was the 9 Years' War, that was the massive plantation of Munster, that was the issuing of martial law writs by martial law writs to new English officers who used them to terrorize the locals. But it is to say that there are many ways to get to the mass violence and colonial dominance promoted by Spencer. And here's one of the famous lines from the View of the Present State of Ireland. And to the Queen, Barbarism was more an act of disloyalty than it was a centralized difference, and punishment, a form of cruel to be kind, needed to bring her subjects back into the light of a divinely ordained subjecthood. But what about the Irish side? From a Gaelic Irish perspective, a queen was not so much an oddity as a category error. The Irish had a sense of royal hierarchy. There were kings and there were high kings. So to take an example, an O'Kane. So an O'Kane could be, king in the local area, and so lorded over the locals. But the limit of that power was bordered by his responsibilities to greater regional powers, i.e. the O'Neills. And that sense of differential executive authority is something in part responsible for the long history of Irish playing along with English royal authority in the wake of the 12th century Norman invasion. For instance, no fewer than 80 Gaelic lords made their submissions to Richard II during his Irish progress of 1394 and 95. And of course, we have already discussed Henry VIII and the program of surrender and regrant. But a queen was not a possibility in the Irish system. Succession there did not follow primogeniture. Rather, executive authority was a more fluid, contractual, and dynamic thing, by which a number of males out of a close kinship circle could hold the kingship, the lordship, if they had the proper force and the proper sort of PR behind them to do so. It did not follow primogeniture. And I've described this at various points in the past, that the Irish system of succession is one that was always in crisis, but never in crisis. And the English system was one that was never in crisis until it was. By that, what I mean is there was always a little bit of sort of low-scale warfare and contention going on in the Irish system because it was a system in which one had to constantly legitimate one's position at the head of a political unit, the head of a family. But it was never in a crisis in the sense that you could always find, a male head of age to hold up the lordship. And the English system, on the other hand, was never in crisis. You knew exactly what was going to come along because of lineage, except of course when you didn't. And so to take, to think in comparative terms, yes, we have low-scale warfare in late medieval Ireland, but we do not have the Wars of Roses. So the presence of Elizabeth as head of state, not to mention the church, was seen as some variety of barbarism in and of itself, about which we could say much more. But I want to focus on something else, which is to say that all the same, she does show up in Irish sources as a prince on the European stage. And this is an example from the Annals of LOCH, 1586, 1589, in which the chronicler, remarking on European continental politics, places Elizabeth within the mix. And here you can see her in the first instance, she is listed as prince, right? And then in the second as queen. So again, whatever about the curiosity of the system, Gaelic succession versus Irish, she does show up in the chronicles as one of the heads of state in European perspective. More curious is this, which is a very curious poem and one on which much more work might be done. And the poet, the person who wrote it, seems to be connected to the Butler Earls of Ormond. Again, these people, who indeed employed Irish poets throughout the late medieval period and into the 16th century, and thus would explain why there might be a eulogistic verse to Elizabeth coming out of this kind of cultural milieu. But in spite of all the praise, curiously, the poet never actually names her, a typical feature of panegyric, which I find curious. But in any case, in an interesting link to our opening about Elizabeth at Oxford, elsewhere in the poem, Elizabeth is praised for her facility with languages. But the particular part I've showed here is an argument about the legitimacy of her being sovereign of Ireland. That said, A stronger current of thought in the Irish archive, however, was an increasingly insistent disdain for encroaching English cultural and social modes. These are just two quatrains out of a very famous poem, A Ear a Chalducht. If the previous poem that we looked at was one of praise, this is one of criticism. In it, the poem excoriates the honorant for abandoning the true ways of nobility in favor of the effeminate fashions of England and London. By contrast, and this is the person we see in quatrain 4, Owen Bawn, he is the true heir of Donnacha, the true good son, for he lives roughly and favors war and the hunt. Now, Elizabeth rarely actually shows up by name, not simply just in that previous poem, but in the Irish language archive over the course of the 16th century. Distrust of the state, however, if not explicitly the Queen, would continue to develop, and certainly over the course of the 9 Years' War, which ran from 1594 to 1603. And the emergence of London as the undisputed center of power in the realms was met with concern. Indeed, London shows up with increasing frequency in Irish writings of this period. And it does so with a sense of both acknowledgement of its centrality, as in this famous poem to James at his accession, as we can see here in the court of Fairstream, England, his place heirs noble crown. It means misery of heart to see it in the power of the warriors of London. This acknowledgement of the sovereignty of James, of the authority of James, but also a sort of grudging sort of respect for that, but an acknowledgement that to a certain extent, might did make right in Ireland, thus reference to red sordid era. But the centrality of the metropole was also met with a sense of dread. It was not a place where one wished to be, and it was feared that a journey there would end up being one way. And this is a early 17th century poem about Neil Garve O'Donnell, who was imprisoned in the Tower of London. And we can see here the poet Owen Ruamach saying that, look, this is not simply a matter of the imprisonment of Neil Garve himself, but rather his imprisonment means the imprisonment of all those whom he has left behind in Ireland, kin, followers, and the like. In the retrospective literature that was composed after her reign, Elizabeth started to take on a greater association with the disaster that was the collapse of the Gaelic system and of indigenous power. She starts to get named. The very famous heroic biography by Louis O'Clery of Red Hugh O'Donnell, who was the main ally of Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, during the 9 Years' War. In that book, in that biography, O'Clery lays much of the responsibility for the escalation of the war and the terror of the war firmly at the feet of the Queen. Now, modern historiography might tell us that Burley and other counselors called most of the shots in Ireland. Undoubtedly that is true, but O'Clery was in no doubt as to who ultimately drove the regime's decisions. And this selection, I think, matches nicely with what we've seen above regarding Elizabeth, namely that the insult of not acting like true subjects was a motivating factor in her escalation of the conflict. And this particular piece comes after the failed peace negotiations in 1596 that was scuttled by O'Donnell. He's saying that the English will never deal with you squarely. It will always be a false peace, and they will bide their time until they can come after you. Right? And I mean, this is sort of a beautiful line. She gets news about the failed peace, and anger and wrath seized her, and that is the motivation for her to send over a proper army. By mid-century, that association of Elizabeth with cultural destruction, the oppression of Ireland, and heresy was made explicit. In the course of the wars of the 1640s and the protectorate of the 1650s, new forms of political poetry emerged. These were not the strict meter poems of the bardic schools, but rather more song-like meter compositions. They were more popular, and they were also more explicit regarding politics. Here's a brief little selection from one, a very popular one, famous one, Turf na Heron. It's been translated as Ireland's dirge, which shows her placed in the pantheon of those who have brought destruction down upon Ireland. So the English princes, it's her father, and it is her. This is an evil tale. And it is also James, who in spite of Jacobitism, you can see the ways in which all three of these characters are charged with following Luther, denying the church, with the kinds of effects that, which I suppose are unfortunately obvious. But when I say that these were more explicit poems, I also mean that they could be quite scurrilous. And here are a few lines from another poem of the period, which is known now as Anshigi Rovalnach, so the Roman sprite, in which you see the insertion into poetry of the old line about the incest of Henry and Anne Boleyn, and the line about Elizabeth, though she married no man, refused none, and the calling of her as a harlot. And I think this is really interesting too. It's not simply that she refuses no man and that she is a harlot, but she makes a desert of Aver's Plain, and this is one of the poetic names for Ireland, and laid at her feet is responsibility for death of population, men, women, and then very specifically Mary Stuart. So again, a queen might be unique, but not someone that one could follow. And that perspective of Ireland and the decline, that perspective of Elizabeth and the decline of Ireland would pass down into the modern period through many channels, but in part given the enduring popularity of these poems. And just tell a very quick story. I run a community Irish language reading group here, and one week, one of the participants said she had a book, it was written in Irish, she couldn't read it, could she bring it in? She couldn't make sense of it. And I assumed, given what she had said, that it was unreadable because it was a book published in the early part of the 20th century, and it was in the old typeface, the Shanchlo, and thus it was difficult for her to read. But rather, she showed up with this, a commonplace book begun in 1825 by somebody named William Healy, written in White Rock in County Cork. Most of the material in the commonplace book is of a religious nature, some historical material, but pride of place is given to Turf na Heron. And here we can see, if you follow the cursor there, Elizabeth mentioned, King of Saxons. Right? And there are hundreds of copies of these poems, Shigi Rovalnach, Turf na Heron from the 19th century. And as you now see, they even show up in Connecticut. And curiously then, in the modern period, we see some continuity actually with the early modern period in terms of that dynamic of Irish views of both Elizabeth and of England, for in addition to this common conception of her as agent of heresy and responsible for Ireland's decline, there were Irish language works that mirrored that early modern sense of England as culturally corrupting and London as threatening. And here are two famous works by the Galway author Pádraic O'Connorragh, which absolutely savage London as site of corruption and vice. Scoiscéalta has a series of short stories. Juriacht is a thoroughly depressing book about someone who goes to work in London from the Gaeltacht, ends up getting into an accident, terribly damaged, and descends into basically drunkenness and insanity. Now, with that said, the dynamic again worked the same the other way. For every proponent of home rule, like a Gladstone, there was a reader or editor of Punch with its explicitly racist depictions of the Gaelic Irish as primates. Nor, of course, are we done with these dynamics at the monarchical executive level. Another Elizabeth has recently visited the island, and here she is visiting the Trinity Long Room. More recently still, if I understand this correctly, an Irish-speaking Irish head of state, President Michael T. Higgins, has declined to appear in person with the Queen at an event commemorating partition and the creation of Northern Ireland. Tout se change, perhaps, but perhaps not. I don't want to end this presentation on a dour note suggesting troubles and interminable troubles across what are now in fact international borders. And moreover, as an American, I want to stay in my lane. But nor do I want to end with some platitudinous comments about light, overcoming barbarism, and building an understanding in Irish-English relations that could overcome the difficult legacy left us, at least in part, by choices made in the 16th century. Although, maybe I do. Or at least I do want to come back to Elizabeth's the first visit to Oxford and her concern over the barbarism of her language deficiencies and to her interest in the English language. We live in a moment when decolonization is a major concern of academic institutions. Oxford and indeed Trinity, James University have both aggressively set down this path to reckoning with problematic paths. And it strikes me as interesting, perhaps ironic, or at least hopeful, that the two institutions, and I believe these are the only two institutions of higher education founded by Elizabeth, Jesus College, Oxford, and Trinity College, Dublin, are at the forefront of this particular corner of the decolonizing process. And there is decolonization to do closer to home. Jesus, with the fellows in the Celtic Library, the chair of Celtic, the connection to the Welsh government and language, and general support for pan-Celtic subjects, has a role to play here. Trinity, with its world-leading early modern language and history faculty, has a role to play in this too. And thus I'll end with a picture of members of both of those institutions, Mark Williams, of course, of Oxford, Archie Cornish of Oxford, and Deirdre McCorg of Trinity College, Dublin, posing after a workshop done at Jesus a few years back on the learning of early modern Irish. Elizabeth may not have gotten around to it, but there's still time and opportunity for the rest of us to do so, and to do so in part by benefit of the educational patronage that she's left to us, and perhaps guided in part by her model of banishing the barbarism of linguistic incuriosity. Shinamage, good.
That was wonderful, Brendan. Thank you very much. I must say I was smiling at that picture of the long room with Elizabeth and the young harpist, Prince Philip, when he came with her on that occasion. And he spent a lot of time ogling that young woman. Thank goodness that wasn't captured for posterity. But joking aside, obviously Trinity, like Jesus College, Oxford, has this very strong link with Elizabeth. And when Elizabeth II visited, she was shown the charter, and it was a very, I suppose, moving visit, because obviously there was a lot of anxiety around it. But and there were snipers on the roof. Security was at a premium. So it was really quite an extraordinary moment. And as you say, we're now embarking on how we engage with our colonial legacy in Trinity, as colleagues are in Oxford and elsewhere. So it's a very interesting moment to be talking, if you want, about colonialism, empire, and Elizabeth. But listening to you as well, I'm actually here in Donegal, northwest Donegal, the heart of Tyrconnell, and obviously you get a very different perspective on it all from the far northwest. So anyway, as usual, a fantastic paper, so deliciously delivered, erudite and learned. Lots of questions popping up in the chat function, and I think we'll try and take as many as we can, Brendan. But let's start with Amanda's. Did the Gaelic Irish view themselves as Irish, or were more loyal to the clan? Was that more important? For example, did an O'Neill think themselves primarily Irish or an O'Neill? Now, cutting to the chase there in terms of identity.
Yeah, no, I suppose it's true. And I suppose I'm actually going to really dodge the question, because I mean, I think there is a distinction between identity and loyalty, right? And I mean, clearly there was a sense of a sort of the importance of family. I mean, in the same way in which there's an incredible importance, if you're the, Duke of Northumberland or some such thing, right? And I mean, in certain ways, I've talked about I sort of think about this system as being one that is guided by divine favor, but not determined by divine right, right? And so I think those families, as they continue over time, are quite distinct from those who are lower than them in the social hierarchy. So I think there's a very distinct difference in terms of identity. But I think that sense of like that of Irish, I think is there. Certainly, say, to take that example, Amanda, your example of an O'Neill, the O'Neills, like on the one hand, are sort of great claimants to the high kingship of all of Ireland, but also all of these characters, as we'll see in the 16th and 17th century, also think of themselves as the sons of Meal, right? As connected in a genealogical line going back to Spain and going back to Greece. So I wouldn't pick one over the other. I think it is a really interesting question, though, about political loyalty. And I think that's really where these things start to play out. I don't know if that makes sense.
Great, thank you, Brendan. I'm keen to get in as many questions as we can. So if we can move on to Breed McGrath, she's got two questions here, but they're related. Could Elizabeth's question whether Hoth spoke English be read as her checking whether it would be suitable to converse with him in Latin? And do we have comparable understanding of the relationship between Elizabeth and the Welsh?
Well, in the second one, I don't have the biggest idea. So if anybody in the room wants to pipe in and throw something, I don't know. I mean, my suspicion is no, but that's
a good question, Breed.
Talk about darkness and ignorance. That's all I can do for you, Breed. Breed is perform my ignorance. That's a really good question. The first one. I mean, I suppose. Sure. I mean, that's very possible. But I read it, and the person that actually made me aware of this example is Valerie McGowan Doyle, and she, I think, takes it as an example of like, who are these characters? Can they speak English? So I guess that would be my response.
Thanks very much. We'll keep on going, Brendan.
Yeah, I'll just keep rolling. Yeah,
John.
And again, honestly, people, you have my email. You can write to me. It's perfectly fine. You can yell at me.
So John Coopers, that's a really interesting point about gender and Irish concepts of kingship. Was it more difficult for Gaelic lords to submit to Elizabeth than it had been for them to accept the overlordship of Richard II or the kingship of Henry VIII? Again, thanks for a great talk.
Yeah, John, I mean, first of all, thank you so much for the very kind words. Yeah, I know, absolutely brilliant. And I think it's really, really interesting. Like if you take the poem, there were, again, very famous poem, 3 Crowns in James's Charter. People are very interested to see James on the throne for a variety of reasons, Scotland, Ireland, this and that. But the gender issue, I think, is absolutely critical. I think you're entirely right. And I think it helps explain why Elizabeth is problematic. And again, you can talk about her like on the continent as being prince, or this, that, the other thing, but might be a little dicey, for you to make that submission. Whereas along comes a male head of state, even though they're Protestant, you're like, oh yeah, that's fine, I'll deal with that, right? So, and then sort of the run of, the Stuarts. I mean, obviously the Stuarts will get sort of connected with confession going out, but I think that's absolutely dead on, and best wishes from Connecticut. Matt.
Yeah, Matt Ryan's. It's interesting, especially in the light of Elizabeth's rhetoric about barbarism, that one of your Gaelic Irish sources embraced the savage. Does that appear across other contemporary Gaelic Irish sources? Yeah,
it's a great question. Thanks, Matt. And I was actually thinking about trying to say something about that, like particular use of that word, because I mean, that sense, the word that's used, it, has that sense. I mean, there are other people in here in this room, I'm sure, who could speak at some length about this. I think it has more of that sense of sort of like a kind of robust wildness, right? In sort of control of, living and controlling nature, the hunt, fighting, It is not the kind of barbarism. Like there's a different word. There's a different word for like barbarism, like Donnertham, right? Like that's barbarism, right? And that's sort of related to foreigners and Vikings and that's that. So it's a bad translation. And I actually thought about like, you know, because I mean, in some of the stuff I use my own translations, but if it was printed and I was just going to steal, I just stole the whole thing. It just didn't seem right. And I think actually one could really dig into that word because it shows distinction between, say, like wildness as a sort of positive, and savage as a negative.
You know what, we're trying to fit in one, maybe two more quickly, Brendan. So we've got one here from Damien McShane. To what extent does Elizabeth I and her regime's opinion of an interaction with the Irish reflect a continuation with previous Tudor attitudes and policies vis-a-vis the Irish and her Stuart successors? Hugely broad question here.
Yeah.
There could be another lecture there, but I suppose it's the continuity.
Yeah. Thanks for putting me on the spot, Damien. Great questions. What exists?
They are great questions.
Yeah. And her regime's opinion of an interaction with the Irish reflected continuation of previous attitudes and policies of the Irish and her Stuart successors. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's a real break in many ways because I think I mean, Elizabeth, you know, domestically. Right, and like one of the reasons that people are so interested in James coming to the throne is because the kinds of things that would make the O'Neills of the world happy, right, the O'Donnells of the world happy, are some of the same things that would make an Essex happy, you know, or a Norfolk happy, or you know, what have you, which are sort of, you know, aristocratic dominance and martial action, and Elizabeth does not. You know, Elizabeth does not pursue war. She does not like to spend money on sort of chivalric display. She does not like to raise people to the peerage and this and that. And so, I think what she's doing is a real break. I think there are serious distinctions, and I do actually think, like, I don't want to give her like too much credit, but I don't want to give her none. The sort of cultural curiosity I think is fascinating. I mean, Henry doesn't care about this stuff, right? You know, Edward doesn't care. Oh my heavens, no. You know, I don't think Mary does either. I mean, Elizabeth is quite curious. James kind of does. I mean, he's an intellectual, but he comes from a very different setting. So yes, there are elements of continuity, but just like on the spot, I think I'd actually make it. If I had to put my money down, I'd say it's a really interesting break. And I'm with really tragic results.
Brendan, it sort of ties into the question that Carol Ann Lloyd had as well. She said she was working at the Folger when you created the exhibition, and it's the extent to which Elizabeth was influenced by her predecessors. But maybe we can finish with the question from Manisha Sinha, and she says this question from left field: since Walter Raleigh explored the New World under Elizabeth I, what do you make of the argument that British origins of African slavery lay in Tudor poor laws and English colonization, and view of the Irish rather than the Spanish and Portuguese precedent in the Americas? Obviously, Claire Carroll has done some very interesting work on this, but what's your response to that one?
Well, I mean, I think I'm going to sort of dodge this one, I suppose, too, because I think that, you know, one of the dangers here is trying to find a kind of monocausal, and Manisha, certainly you're not saying this, but trying to find a monocausal explanation for a kind of multivalent development. I mean, it does seem to me, I mean, I think it's absolutely right that the Tudor poor laws exercise a particular kind of savagery and a particular kind of dehumanization, which is really critical. But at the same time, I do think that the argument that some of the ways in which the Irish are portrayed comes from the sort of New World language of encounter. It's like, oh, right, that's actually a useful discourse to deploy against people who are annoying us at home, rather than like, oh, we see savagery close by and we go farther, we apply that as kind of heuristic and frame. So that's a wishy-washy answer, but but I mean, it strikes me as probably right, you know, in the sense that if you start to sort of pull these threads out, you know, you're going to land in different in different areas. You're going to land in Ulster, you're going to land in Munster, and you're going to land in, you know, the sort of isthmus of, you know, the New World.
Well, I was going to say Manisha's response is not a bad answer. So I think, listen, you've done a fantastic job, Brendan, and it was sort of 40 questions there. We've crammed a lot into the last 10 minutes, but our time is up. And I suppose on all of our behalves, if I can thank you again for just, I mean, an absolutely fascinating paper, so brilliantly delivered, and for really sort of giving a very refreshing perspective on Elizabeth and Elizabethan Ireland.
Thank you. Just to echo Jane again, thank you so much, Brendan, for a fascinating, wonderful paper, and to Jane for chairing the session so brilliantly.